Everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it's our pleasure today to host the U.S. release, the Washington meeting, around the WTO's newest World Trade Report. This is a flagship publication, and it's one we all read with great interest, and I want to give particular praise, frankly, to Ralph Ossa and his team, some of whom are with us today, for taking on one of the biggest themes out there, which is the incursion of securitization, of geopolitics and strategic rivalry into the world trading system and into the economy. We all know that's always been an issue, and we all know that the WTO, and before it the GATT, was designed to have special exemptions for countries' national security needs, and this was both right and reasonable when used in the right way. Starting with the Trump administration's abuse of the national security exemption, we know that increasingly governments, including the US government, have been using this the wrong way. But that's the narrow, specific application. What this World Trade Report addresses, and I think is fundamentally helpful to global understanding, is going further into the costs of fragmentation, the specifically multilateral aspects that are being undermined, and the possibilities for bringing multilateral trade and rules-based trade back together. This is not something one report will solve, and nor do I want to suggest in the world we're living in that national security concerns are unimportant, and I know that the WTO team doesn't suggest that either. But it is important that the World Trade Organization and people here at the Peterson Institute and our guests and our community around the world watching do set forth cleanly and clearly all the various implications and problems that go with casual disregard of the system that's been built over decades and the fragmentation that is being done both intentionally and unintentionally in the security situation on people's economic lives, particularly in the developing world. So with that, today I'm very pleased to have with us Ralph Ossa, who is the Chief Economist and Director of Economic Research and Statistics Division at the World Trade Organization. He joined the WTO after a distinguished career in academia with appointments at Princeton, the University of Chicago, and the University of Zurich. He is focused on international economic questions of policy relevance, which is why we all knew and read him before he got to the WTO. And he has even worked directly on the issue of economics of trade wars. He'll be leading off, presenting some of the main material from the report. We're then going to be followed by our longtime distinguished colleague, Anabel Gonzalez, who has recently left the WTO after having been Deputy Director General, and has now taken up the incredible title, I think it's Vice President for Countries at the Inter-American Development Bank. My wife was doing some consulting for NASA, and somebody gave her a business card, Director of the Universe. So this is the next best thing. But joking aside, Anabel is a great international public servant in the realm of trade, representing her home country of Costa Rica. She's a dual U.S. Costa Rican citizen. Leading in work at the World Bank as Senior Director of Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice, as Minister of Foreign Trade in Costa Rica previously, and more recently, of course, as Deputy Director General of the WTO for more than 2 years, I believe. She remains a non-resident senior fellow here at Peterson and is on leave for this kind of public service. Most importantly, she will not, I'm sure she will agree in spirit, but no longer being a WTO DDG, she will not agree in script necessarily with what Ralph and the team have to offer. Finally, one of our most distinguished colleagues, Douglas Irwin, is going to speak. I may come in a bit, but it's mostly for our two distinguished colleagues. Doug is the John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College. He is the person who made trade policy history both relevant and popular. It's an incredible series of books and regularly updated. Is not just the textbook that everyone reads, but a book that everyone cites and thinks about, including such works as Free Trade Under Fire. Doug has been a distinguished academic, research associate of the NBER. He served on the staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the mid-'80s and at the Division of Finance, International Finance of the Board of Governors in the late 80s. He's taught at the University of Chicago before establishing one of the world's leading international economics departments at Hanover, New Hampshire, and Dartmouth. And again, I'm proud to say he is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Peterson Institute. So with that, let me turn it over to Ralph and take us through the sad realities of the fragmenting world. What should we know and what can we do about it?
Well, thank you very much, Adam, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's really great for us to be here. And it's also great to see so many familiar faces, particularly my former boss, Annabelle. And I still don't have a new boss, so I guess, perhaps you're still my boss a little bit. So the World Trade Report 2023 asks a big question. What is the role of international trade in building a more secure, inclusive, and sustainable world? And this question lies at the core of a contentious debate about the future of globalization, which has potentially far-reaching consequences also for the future of the WTO. Now, it's widely acknowledged that trade brings about substantial economic gains, but it's increasingly argued that we need to sacrifice some of these gains in pursuit of more important policy objectives, in particular to maintain peace and security, to reduce poverty and inequality, and to achieve a sustainable economy. And that's a fundamental departure from the trade-affirming narrative that has been guiding trade policy making since the foundation, really, of the multilateral trading system in 1947. Now, this new narrative is, of course, not coming out of nowhere. It has gained traction amongst a series of crises and tectonic shifts in the balance of economic power, the global balance of economic power. Of course, rising geopolitical tensions create concerns about the weaponization of trade policy. The COVID pandemic made clear that resilience of supply chains is something that we need to be thinking about. The rise of China has put pressure on workers in some industrialized countries, in particular this country here, the United States. And many people, or some people, wonder whether in the face of the climate crisis, really, trade is compatible with the necessary decarbonization of the economy. Now, against this background, this report starts off by showing that this change in narrative really matters. In the sense that, while trade continues to thrive in many ways, we see trade policy tensions rising and first signs of fragmentation emerging. So in some sense, that's the first main point that the report is making. Trade continues to thrive in many ways, but trade tensions are rising and first signs of fragmentation are emerging. Now, you see the rise of trade tensions everywhere, but you can also see them in various WTO bodies. For example, if you look at the number of trade concerns raised in our Committee on Market Access, you see that they quadrupled between 2015 and 2022. And the number of unresolved concerns, which were then escalated to the more political Council for Trade in Goods, even increased ninefold over the same time period. Now, perhaps the most striking finding of this first part of the report is that trade is gradually becoming reoriented along geopolitical lines. So what we did is we used the standard measure that is used in academia to measure foreign policy similarity and basically looked at voting patterns in the UN General Assembly and grouped the world into two hypothetical geopolitical blocs. And then what we show is that since the onset of the war in Ukraine, trade between these two hypothetical blocs has been growing by 4 to 6% less than trade within these hypothetical geopolitical blocs, indicating perhaps a shift towards friendshoring. At the same time, it's really important to emphasize that talk of deglobalization is still far from supported by the data. We have bilateral trade between China and the US still reach a record high in 2022. Trade was remarkably resilient also during the COVID pandemic, recovering to pre-pandemic levels basically in less than a year since the first wave of, after the first wave of lockdowns. And another bright spot is the growth of digitally delivered services, which since 2005 have been growing at an average rate of 8.1% per year, outpacing growth in goods trade and also trade in other services. So after having established that the change in the narrative matters, the report then turns to its main question and really, reviews the evidence on the role of trade in building a more secure, inclusive, and sustainable world. And the main conclusion, and that's the second main result, but I think really the main point of the report, is that we need to embrace trade instead of rejecting it if we want to overcome the most pressing challenges of our time. And in particular, the report makes the case for something that we call re-globalization. And by re-globalization, we mean extending trade integration to more economies, to more people, and to more issues. And I'll come back to that, giving you some examples of what I mean by this re-globalization in the sense of extending trade integration to more economies, people, and issues. Now this more analytical part then begins with an analysis of the relationship between trade and security, understood broadly to include economic aspects such as access to critical goods and also resilience to shocks. And the key conclusion is that a strong multilateral trading system is the best guarantor of economic security because it gives you access to the outside options you need when you're faced with supply shortages. A case in point here is the response of trade to the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, international supply chains became vital to ramping up the production of medical supplies, with trade in medical goods growing by 16%, trade in personal protective equipment rising by almost 50%, and trade in face masks even rising by 80%, basically giving us the goods that we needed to get through the pandemic. Another example are the supply chain disruptions associated with the war in Ukraine, where a major food security crisis could be avoided thanks to open trade. And an interesting example that we highlight here is the case of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia imported 45% of its wheat from Russia and the Ukraine, and obviously, these imports, tanked, went down sharply after the outbreak of the war, with imports from Ukraine basically going to zero and imports from Russia falling by 75%. However, Ethiopia was able to respond to this by quickly substituting to alternative sources of supply, and in particular importing a lot of wheat from Argentina, from the US, from the EU, which is interesting because it hadn't really imported any wheat from Argentina before. And clearly, such a swift substitution towards alternative sources of supply would have been much harder in a fragmented world. Now, at the same time, the report stresses the need for expanding economic integration to more economies. And this is the first example, then, of our notion of re-globalization. The share of bottleneck products, which we define as products that have both few suppliers but large market shares, has more than doubled from 9% to 19% of all traded goods between 2000 and 2021. The report then turns to the relationship between trade and inclusiveness. It shows that trade integration is a powerful tool to improve living standards, which helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. From 1981 to 2019, lower and middle income economies increased their share in global exports from 19% to 29% and reduced the share of their population subsiding on less than $2.15 per day from 55% down to 10%. So really a dramatic reduction in poverty, which was also supported by expanding international trade. At the same time, the report also acknowledges that import competition contributed to the loss of manufacturing jobs in countries like the United States, but it emphasizes that trade openness can go hand in hand with economic inclusion, which suggests that having complementary domestic policies in place is really key. And for example, some of the most open economies in the world, including Germany, Latvia, and the Netherlands, are also some of the most equal ones. Highlighted in this part of the report is the need for reglobalization, again, including this time expanding economic integration to more people. For example, African women would gain disproportionately from trade cost reduction in digitally delivered services, given that 3 out of 4 African firms trading exclusively through e-commerce are owned by women. The report then finally looks at the relationship between trade and sustainability. It acknowledges that the relationship is complex, but also makes clear that there's substantial scope for trade to be part of the solution to climate change. For example, trade provides access to technologies which are of critical importance for the green transition. The import of high-quality wind turbines would be a case in point, as they allow wind-rich countries to scale up their renewable energy generation, even if they don't have access to this technology themselves. Talking about the relationship between trade and sustainability also provides a good illustration of the need to expand trade integration to more issues, which, remember, was the third dimension of reglobalization that we emphasize in the report. Because it turns out that trade is a powerful force multiplier for climate policies. Simulations show that more than 1/3 of the emissions reductions achieved by a global carbon tax would be due to environmental gains from trade. Just as there are economic gains from trade, which come from countries specializing in what they're relatively good at, there's also environmental gains from trade, which come from countries specializing in what they're relatively green at. But this requires open trade with coordinated climate action, and in that sense, an expansion of economic integration to more issues. Of course, the report also discusses the role of the WTO in fostering reglobalization. It underlines that WTO members have already made progress towards this goal in recent years. Examples include multilateral agreements like the Trade Facilitation Agreement and the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, as well as plurilateral outcomes on services, domestic regulation, and investment facilitation for development. To give you just one number, WTO estimates show that the Trade Facilitation Agreement has led to a $231 billion increase in trade, and these trade gains have particularly accrued to least developed countries, the exports of which decreased by 2.4%, with a 17% increase in the agriculture sector. But to achieve a secure, inclusive, and sustainable future, more needs to be done. The WTO Trade Cost Index shows that trade costs in middle and low-income countries are 27% higher than in high-income countries. Trade costs in services are 34% higher than in manufacturing. And trade costs in agriculture are 46% higher than in manufacturing. This points to trade cost reductions for developing countries in agriculture and in services, so trade cost reductions for developing countries in agriculture and in services, including digitally delivered services as natural priorities for the future. Let me stop here, but let me conclude by thanking everyone who has contributed to this report, particularly Victor, who has coordinated the report this year and really done a fantastic job.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Adam, for the invitation. I am delighted to have the opportunity to comment on the U.S. launch of the WTO 2023 World Trade Report here at the Peterson Institute, and to share the stage with you, with Doug, and of course with my former WTO colleague and friend, Ralph Ossa. As I am transitioning from my previous WTO life to a new job at the IDB while being on leave from PIIE, it is probably easier for me just to speak on my personal capacity. So the World Trade Report 2023 makes a very solid case that a better alternative to fragmentation is reglobalization. That is bringing more people, more economies and issues into the global trading system. And it will not come as a surprise to you that I agree with this. Today, however, I would like to take a step further and argue that to advance reglobalization, we need to manage fragmentation, even as we wish it could go away. I will make 3 points with a special focus on economic security before concluding with my main message. First, the fact that the world has avoided a full-fledged decoupling scenario is cold comfort for those who believe that trade is part of the answer, not the problem, to solving global challenges. Second, in a world confronting increased security risks, expanded trade can be a source of economic security more than economic insecurity. And third, as an expanded notion of security brings with it increased potential for trade frictions, revised global rules are needed to manage fragmentation. So on the first point, the report makes an excellent job in bringing clarity to the nature of the changes affecting globalization. Ralph mentioned it, that trade tensions are rising and trade and investment flows are shifting, driven by heightened uncertainty and compounding crisis. The report also shows that while trade has become increasingly reoriented around geopolitical lines, it has also been extremely resilient, and in the case of China and the US, has reached record levels. The finding that so far the world has avoided a worst-case scenario of full decoupling is not very reassuring, though. The cost of fragmentation may not come close to the estimated 5% loss in GDP that would result from full decoupling, but the trend towards policy-driven reversal of global integration is deeply worrisome. With fragmentation comes reduced prosperity, increased prices, it also slower growth and innovation, and increased social risk and instability, at a time when many in both advanced and developing countries are already struggling to find the means to live a decent life. Now, recent analysis also confirms that fragmentation is already happening and may have unintended consequences. PIIE's own Chad Bown has shown that US exports to China have continued to suffer since the trade confrontation started in 2018. For 2022, Chad shows that US goods exports are falling farther behind foreign peers also selling in the Chinese market. And US services exports plunged during the pandemic and have not yet come back. A novel study by the Bank for International Settlements shows that changes in sourcing patterns have increased complexity of supply chains without making them more robust, and it reduces efficiency and adds cost, potentially fueling inflation. Now, on the second point, the World Trade Report makes a strong case for trade as a source of economic security. In contrast to the widely accepted view, COVID and the Ukraine war have shown that global value chains underpinned by the rules-based trading system were resilient and adapted relatively quickly in the face of massive shocks. Despite initial disruptions, trade provided a lifeline in terms of food and medical supplies during the pandemic. And for example, when scientists developed at record speed the COVID-19 pandemic, multi-country supply chains came together to provide the specialized inputs and the capital goods that were needed for large-scale production. Ralph also put the example of Ethiopia, that in the context of the Ukraine war, basically saw how trade performed a lot better than most feared by allowing, again, countries like Ethiopia to find alternative sources of supply, particularly for cereals. Now, while the global trading system has proven resilient, I think the report also makes a very good case that the risk landscape is changing and becoming more complex. Ralph mentioned the example of bottleneck products that have increased sharply over the past 2 decades. And this is a reality that requires attention. It cannot just be swept under the carpet. Now, against this backdrop, I think the report rightly so calls for deepening and diversifying supply chains and highlights the need to bring more economies to the global economy, one of these aspects of what it calls reglobalization. Now, while this is certainly a very important part of the answer, it is not enough to simply insist on a return to first best policies. Judging by the current narrative on trade and economic security, policymakers in some places are yet to be convinced that broad and diversified trade is the best guarantor of economic security. So this brings me to my third point. The concept of security associated with conventional war has significantly expanded and has taken center stage in much trade and economic policy making. And in a world of great power politics, economic security has risen in relevance as countries seek to limit the use of interdependence as a tool for coercion and prevent economic shocks that could destabilize their own economies and societies. Now, with the expansion of the concept of security comes increased trade frictions, heightened policy uncertainty, and fragmentation, all of which undermine rather than strengthen economic security. Now, the drive towards economic security and de-risking have often become intertwined with greater self-sufficiency, which in turn can be used as a cover for blunt, inward-looking policies that are highly distortionary and come with significant cross-border spillovers, which hit the poorest countries hardest. Now, shifting from fragmentation to reglobalization in the current political environment will require countries to redefine what is considered legitimate in terms of trade measures to achieve economic security and other non-trade objectives, instead of adopting overly broad kitchen sink approaches. Now, international organizations, think tanks, academics can support these efforts by providing a strong evidence base about the cost and benefits of different policy alternatives, including the cross-border effects of specific policies on the most vulnerable countries. Governments, for their part, need to engage in a serious discussion on the guardrails that are needed to keep fragmentation of the world economy in check for all the reasons cited. It could also give governments the political space needed to renew their commitment to deeper trade cooperation in those areas where trade cooperation is possible and urgently needed. So in concluding, let me say a word why this discussion should take place at the WTO, in my view. Because government officials understand the benefits and challenges associated with increased trade cooperation, it is important to remember that the WTO is a pragmatic system. Escape valves are built into the system to allow sovereign nations to pursue legitimate national security or other objectives while reducing spillover effects on third countries, and Adam made a reference to this. Put differently, while it provides flexibility, the system aims to prevent protectionism spiraling out of control, making sure that transitional measures do not drive permanent wedges into global trade integration. Now, if the system needs recalibration, sooner is better than later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have my copy of the report, which I've downloaded. I need to read paper copies. I highly recommend it. I'll just make a few points to sort of, before we go to the panel. First of all, this is a very effective report. It's very well written. It's effective on multiple dimensions. It in terms of the issues that it covers, in terms of the research that it marshals to make the points that it's making. So I highly recommend it, and congratulations to you, Ralph, and your team for doing it. Like Annabelle, like Adam, this is a sympathetic audience in some sense for the theme of reglobalization. And it does come across a bit in the report that this is an exhortation to more trade, for an exhortation for greater integration. I would rephrase it a little bit in trying to make it a proactive agenda. That is, what we want is not just more trade, but fewer trade barriers. Because trade is not an end unto itself, of course, it's a means to an end, and it's the trade barriers that are essentially the problem. So what we want is fewer trade barriers, less discrimination, and more considered effort to think through the regulations and the subsidies that have been coming. So then the question becomes how to accomplish this. A new round is not in the cards. So what is the WTO to do to accomplish this objective? I think one positive thing that it could do, in partnership, I believe, with the World Bank and the IMF and other institutions, is to try to quantify and provide transparency to the barriers that have arisen and are due to and may come in the future. In the past, this has proved a very useful service for the world trading system. I would point to work done at the OECD on agriculture in the 1980s, which set the groundwork for the Uruguay round and the agreement on agriculture. I'd point to the database that Chad Bound created about anti-dumping measures when he was at the World Bank, and before him, Mike Finger, for drawing attention to the importance of anti-dumping, something that had not been on the radar screen. These databases are very useful for focusing the minds of policymakers, bringing attention to issues, providing clarity, transparency, and allowing us to effectively measure the impact and the costs of such policies. Now, of course, as the whole report points out, we're in a very different world than we were in the past. And the nature of the interventions by governments has changed very much also from the past. So there are two important interventions, I think, which are new features of the environment today. One is subsidies, and the other are regulations. Subsidies are quantifiable, they're overt, they have a fiscal cost, and that fiscal cost naturally limits, I think, the amount and the duration of the expenditures. We need quantification, we need more notifications about these subsidies, but I think that's one of the easier issues to deal with from an economic point of view and certainly analytically. And once, of course, there's transparency and quantification, negotiations can take place. The second one is a harder nut to crack, which is regulation, designed to achieve the various objectives that Ralph pointed out, whether it's climate, security, or what have you. Regulations tend to be sector-specific, tend to be non-transparent, very difficult to quantify, the costs are hidden, and they're difficult to dislodge, because unlike subsidies, they don't have that fiscal cost that is always apparent to policymakers. So regulation is something that's going to be much more difficult to confront in the future, but it's something we have to draw our attention to. What's also different from the past is the goals of these two policies of subsidies and regulation. It's what Jagdish Bhagwati calls a non-economic objective. And Ralph, once again, the report goes through. The objective is not to increase national income or to distort trade in favor of some certain domestic groups. It is to achieve some objective at the sacrifice, as Ralph pointed out, of some national income to achieve objectives of security or climate or things of that sort. And so even if they're transparent, it becomes difficult to evaluate trade-offs when it's not clear what the objective of policymakers is. But this makes the quantification and the transparency even more urgent, because now we're talking about trade-offs, and policymakers, to make correct decisions, have to be aware of the downside or the cost of those trade-offs before they move forward. So I think there's a role for the WTO in partnership with other institutions to try to bring that clarity. I think this report is a step forward just by identifying the issues. Now, of course, the whole background to this report is the changed geopolitical environment that we're operating in. And this is a very difficult environment to operate in when one looks back historically. But it makes the importance of the WTO more clear, because there's a distinction between rules and discretion when it comes to economic policy and trade policy in particular. And what the WTO provides is a rules-based framework for trying to guide countries in terms of the interventions that they cannot pursue or should not. What those rules do is they try to mitigate, as Annabelle pointed out, spillover effects on third parties. It tries to mitigate the fragmentation that can take place, and it can also mitigate the uncertainty that acts as a deterrent to international trade. So I think the challenge is certainly a reglobalization agenda, but also holding the line on the fragmentation that is taking place. As Ralph points out, we don't have clear evidence that there's deglobalization, but there certainly is a fragmentation. And this is where the rules-based system can be an important part of maintaining the system. We have to ensure that the rules are not discarded, and that because we'll need them in any reglobalization effort. And I'm sure that time will come at some point in the future. Thank you very much.
So before calling up all three speakers onto the panel and getting questions from our distinguished audience, I just want to make a couple supplementary or complementary remarks. The first is I do credit, among many other things in the report, that Ralph, Victor, and the team are very honest and upfront about the resilience of trade. As others have mentioned, in addition to their work, our colleague Chad Bown has written about this. Our colleagues at Peterson, Mary Lovely and Abigail Dahlman, have done a recent series on supply chains and the move, which is ongoing. We mentioned the work done by Hyun Shin and his colleagues at the BIS. We're all in different ways coming to the same conclusion. And I think that's, I take fully the points made by Ralph, Doug, and Annabelle. That's not a sign for joy. But I do think it's important to point out for a couple reasons. The first is that there is this disproportionate venom against the WTO and disproportionate blaming on trade in a lot of the high-income economies when, again, trade is actually the resilient part. Trade is actually, in some ways, not the most economically significant part. And when, again, as others mentioned, if your real goal is reliability of supply in critical goods or national security, what matters is diversification, stockpiling, access, not necessarily just simply not getting stuff from a particular trading partner. But I think more than that, I want to go on to make three other points. First is that it is, and this builds on Doug's point about regulation and subsidies. In a sense, the WTO gets the maximum stick because it is the most well-developed, most multilateral, most legally sophisticated governance in economics we have. We don't have anything akin to it. Looking at subsidies, looking at investment policy, looking at foreign exchange, looking at sovereign debt lending or FDI. And so in a sense, it's partly because the WTO is so important and better developed than in these other areas of the economy that it becomes the target of so much in a period of fragmentation and deglobalization. And that may make all of us who are friends of the WTO feel good and righteous, and there are aspects of Alan Wolf's new book that address some of these issues. But just to say that not just should we feel good, but that we should be aware of that and think about what that means, and think about the fact that it's not just that trade is important or that it's economically sensitive, but because it was the most advanced form of international economic governance, it's the one that's most targeted. This is a different spin on Doug's point about, again, about regulation and subsidies. And so I think that means we should not hold back in saying this is not to be thrown away, or for that matter, indicating that the lack of a regime on subsidies or the lack of a regime on foreign direct investment, regime meaning some kind of international set of rules, if not multilateral, actually leads to worse outcomes. And so I also think that we need to think about the fact that the attacks on the WTO and the fragmentation has to be seen in that context. It's not just about the direct costs of trade not being diverted. The second point, which comes directly out of that, is that we do have to think harder about what would be essentially arms control in the economic sphere. We know that in the Cold War and in other things earlier in the 20th century and in other conflicts or tensions, there have been negotiated agreements even between very strongly opposed entities and countries, even with very real national security things at stake like nuclear warheads or chemical warheads. And it has been possible to achieve arms control, arms reduction. And this is not something that inherently is not really multilateral, so I think that's part of the reason that people who are of good spirit in the pro-globalization sphere don't tend to think in these terms. But I think particularly when we look at subsidies, that's where we're going to have to end up in the next few years, is essentially an EU, US, China, possibly Japan, possibly India, sitting down or standing at standing desks if they prefer, but anyway, coming together and negotiating mutually binding, verifiable reductions in subsidies. I think that that's something we need to do. And even though, as has been realistically the case in the WTO, as Ralph knows, as Doug's histories have written about, as Alan's history has written about, sometimes you have to do things at a G2, 3, 7, 20 level, even if that's not ideal, to get things back on track for the multilateral system. The third point I would make, and this relates to a very brief thing I contributed, thanks to Ralph and Victor and probably Annabelle's invitation, to this year's World Trade Report, which is in the spirit of what was said by all the speakers about using trade to, needing to use trade to address global challenges. We've said many times today about the spillovers on third countries. The system we're going into, or the non-system we've gotten into over the last couple of years, is particularly worse for the developing world. And I think we don't quite say that enough. And we need to say that in the right way, which isn't just the usual, they're poorer, they're smaller, when bad things happen, it hurts them worse, which is true in macroeconomic terms. But that it is specifically is about closing off some of their paths to development, closing off some of their paths to employment, closing off some of their promised access to the world. And the briefing I wrote was about the idea that when we get into these subsidies wars or competitions over green technology, one of the likely negative spillovers is that we're essentially telling everybody who isn't US, China, EU, possibly Japan, possibly India, you don't get to play. Or you're not going to get to produce green technology, or if you get to produce green technology, it's only going to be through the largesse of you politically signing on my team versus the other team. And this is another form of fragmentation. So I just wanted to emphasize that I think the report is a real contribution, but I also want all of us out there who are either believers or persuaded by the report to contextualize the fragmentation of trade, that it's not just about the direct costs of fragmenting trade, which are bad, but because the attack on trade is the attack on the most developed legal fair system for doing international commerce, that the problems we have with the green subsidies are real for the developing world, and that the resilience of trade just reminds us that there are all these other aspects that are potentially getting worse in the background. Not a happy message, but I think in the spirit of what my colleagues from both the WTO and Peterson and the IDB have said, that we have a good case to make. It's important to make the case. It's important to keep at it. So with that, let me ask our three speakers to come up and join the panel. Before I open it up to questions or comments from the floor, and this is all on the record, let me just ask Ralph, is there any response you want to give to anything that was said by the other three? You don't have to, it's just a choice. No, you turned it off.
Turn it off.
Yeah.
I mean, let me maybe just briefly say that I really appreciate thoughtful comments. I've already learned a lot. It's really amazing how with all these events, and I've thought about these things many times now, but always getting these new perspectives. In particular, what you just said about arms control, Alan, that kind of hit a chord with me, because it is true that we have been able, or the world has been able in the past, to come together and find cooperative solutions in much more dire circumstances, and if it was possible with nuclear warheads, why should it not be possible with trade policy? So I find that as scary as it is an encouraging message to take home.
Thank you. So let me open it up. I believe Sarah has a mic, and there's also a standing mic in back. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment on Ralph's presentation, or God forbid on the discussants, please raise your hand and be recognized. We simply ask you to identify yourself when making a comment. Anyone? Please, if you could just go to the standing mic.
Thank you so much. I'm Sherry Stevenson from the PECC, Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, and I would just like to say congratulations to Ralph and to all of those who have spoken on the report. It's excellent. It's timely. It's a needed message, even if it's a disturbing message. I think I want to ask a question that it puzzles me, and I don't quite know how to get around it. And I really appreciated Annabelle's suggestions for how to tackle these headwinds face on and look at it issue by issue and try to analyze each issue cost-benefit. And I believe, Adam, you said the same thing. That would be great, each subsidy, each regulation, if possible. But how do you analyze subsidies and regulations that are targeted to, quote unquote, protect national security, when that is always put off the table? And those issues and those regulations and those subsidies are not to be touched by international discussions, by panel proceedings, or by anything else. And the realm in which they are being used is widening day by day. So how would you get around that issue? Thank you.
I don't know if any of you want to comment, please.
Maybe let me say one thing, which I should have perhaps also said in response to some of the discussions. Some of the speakers were talking about the trade-offs. That perhaps we need to give up some of the gains from trade in order to pursue these non-economic objectives. And kind of accepted that premise. But to some extent, the main point, or an important point of the report, is that we also want to challenge that very premise, that these trade-offs that we think exist in many ways don't exist. For example, when it comes to national security, it's just not a contradiction to trade more and to have more economic security. When it comes to inclusiveness, it's not necessarily a contradiction to have more trade and more inclusiveness. And the same also with sustainability. So I just want to drive that message home again. That doesn't mean, of course, that in specific areas there might not be trade-offs, and security is, of course, a particularly challenging one. I mean, we're also not so naive to think that, you know, there's not going to be any decoupling, and I think this is also what Annabelle then, you know, was talking about. And there, of course, we do need to think about these trade-offs. I mean, I think the idea of guardrails is a good one, or the guiding principle, that you just try to contain it you try to kind of contain the discussion to where these trade-offs are real, and then, you know, put some guardrails to not let it get out of control.
So let me maybe pick on where Ralph concluded, and then come back a bit to Sherry to say that, you know, there are many areas in which countries can cooperate and are actually cooperating in the context of the WTO. Ralph mentioned, look at the fisheries agreement, or now the investment facilitation agreement. So trade cooperation is taking place at some level. Then there are areas where not all members can come together and find cooperation. Now, in the case of investment facilitation, is one of them. So you have trade cooperation at the multilateral level, trade cooperation at the plurilateral level. But I think in the context in which we are today, there are areas where that trade cooperation does not seem to be feasible. So the question is, what do you do in those cases? What is happening right now is that lack of dialogue or lack of negotiation around what are the limits to this are impacting the possibility of cooperating in these other dimensions where cooperation is possible and it is very badly needed. So it's much better to sit down, look at some of these issues. It goes to the point that Adam was making, and figure out what are the guardrails that may be needed, even as hard of an exercise this may be. And the point that I tried to make is that I think it is better that this happens in the WTO, even if it doesn't mean all WTO members sitting and having a conversation around these issues, precisely because of the point that Adam was making. This is the only organization where something like this can happen. And this is a conversation that can not only take place among friends, it needs to take place among those who are the largest player in a particular area. I think if this happens, and I go to your point, Cheryl, then you can separate the conversations. You agree to disagree and to put limits in one area, but then you can go and have a conversation about subsidies more broadly, what are the reforms that are needed to the subsidies code, and you can end up in a better place where we are right now, which is a little bit like nothing happens much because the discussion does not take place on those issues where it needs to take place.
I just want to underscore a very important point that Ralph made that could help to change the narrative. And that is that when there's a non-economic objective, we don't, as economists, just have to sit back and say, okay, we have to think about second best ways to intervene or what have you, but sometimes the trade interventions contradict or go against exactly the objective it's trying to achieve. Yeah. One of the points that, and once again, I didn't have time to go into all the merits of the report, but one I think of the merits is that it's really a first step to changing the narrative about trade, that and not being so defensive and saying, actually, not only is there growth and poverty reduction, what have you, standard things, but that all these new things that have come about, trade is not going to help us achieve some of those objectives. And so that's why I commend the report to you, because it is that first step that I think is very useful. And when we think about defense or what have you, once again, in the past it used to be that if there's not an economic objective, economists really couldn't contribute much to the debate. Can we put a price on defense or on climate or what have you? We can try, but economists weren't in the room. But the Department of Defense, they were against the steel tariffs on national security grounds. The Defense Department is much more pro-globalization than one might think. It's other agencies that tend to be more in favor of the domestic interest. So once again, I think the report's very useful in pointing some of these things out.
Thanks very much. Another question or comment from the floor?
Hi, I'm Mary Lovely from the Peterson Institute. Thanks for a great discussion so far. I wonder if Ralph could talk about the need for cooperation between, or coordination between the WTO and other international organizations. And in particular, I'm thinking about the need for more cooperation on labor standards, which are now being used, I think, to form these are you with us or against us sides. Secondly would be on AI regulation. And thirdly would be in biotech, human rights, and issues like cloning. So I wonder if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I can start, and then maybe some of the other panelists can come in. Annabelle, for example, I'm sure you have thought about this this a lot. So let me maybe first say something general about cooperating with other agencies, and then I can try to start answering some of your specific questions. But I think one thing that we really realize is that many of these issues that also we have characterized as non-economic objectives, so think about sustainability, for example, are inherently cross-cutting issues. If you think about climate change, for example, you need to think about what regulation you put in place. You need to think about possible carbon prices you put in place. You need to think about subsidies you might want to put in place. But you can't, really just think about it from an environmental perspective, because then if you have a fragmented system of carbon prices, you're going to have trade tensions. And then if you have trade tensions, you don't have trade. But then, as we discussed, you need the trade also to achieve the sustainability objectives. So I really think this is important. Digital trade would be another example. We keep saying, you mentioned about you talked about the importance of, also including developing countries and the risks they are subjected to because of this fragmentation. One thing we keep saying at the WTO is that the future of trade is in services and in digitally delivered services. But then how do you get this going? You need the infrastructure in place. How do you get the infrastructure in place? Well, perhaps you need we actually have a project with the World Bank where we work on the kind of the regulation, so to speak, and they also work on getting the infrastructure in place. Now, AI regulation. So I don't have a specific thought on AI regulation, but I can say something about. I guess I already did say something about digital trade more broadly. Because there, really, what we believe is that. You need the right governance in place. And we do have the e-commerce discussions at the WTO, both the plurilateral ones as well as the multilateral ones that are mostly confined to the moratorium. But there we also recognize that you need a whole ecosystem in place for this to thrive. I don't know, Annabelle, if you have anything on labor standards.
So I just want to say, I don't want to speak for the WTO, but the WTO does in fact work very closely with these other organizations, and it works very closely with the World Bank and the IMF, for example, on issues like subsidies, for example. But it also works, for instance, very closely with the ILO on the issue of labor standards, actually working on draft reports, and this is something that has evolved over time. And I think in a world in which it's like trade-related other issues, it's very important, this collaboration. With the World Health Organization and the World Intellectual Property Organization, the WTO has long-standing collaborations that went very deep in the context of COVID. And this is important because it sort of aligns the international organization. In a way, it's a little bit like making the trade-offs that we were discussing before, making that trade-off at that level with the benefit if you made that politics are not necessarily involved. It's a much more sort of technical conversation that takes place that can then inform the political conversation. So I think I would say in most of the areas that you mentioned, Mary, the collaboration is there, and if it's not there, it's just because maybe the area is too new, and the organizations have not approached each other. But I think it's the way to go.
If I may add one thing, maybe not on trade and labor standards narrowly, but on trade and labor or trade and inclusiveness more broadly, one thing that bothers me is that somehow it's become accepted, certainly in the academic community, but I think also in the policy community, that there's, trade has these negative implications for inclusiveness and inequality. And I don't want to minimize what happened here in the US. I do know that import competition from China, did cause harm to, workers in some regions here in the United States. But I do think it's important to also take a step back sometimes and really think about what trade has done to inequality and inclusiveness. And I mean, I talked about it in my presentation, but I mean, it has helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, given hope to, you talked about the path to development, to other developing countries, that you are not necessarily trapped in your poor situation, but that you can use trade to grow your way out of it. So somehow this idea that trade always comes at the expense of workers or comes at the expense of economic equality is just a very limited perspective. I don't want to discredit that it's important, but you also have to put it in context. And if you think about like between country inequality, for example, I mean that has fallen dramatically because of trade. And it's not just China, by the way. I mean there's many other countries, Eastern Europe, for example, other parts of Asia, that have also benefited dramatically, including the workers in these countries.
Here. I think that's a great note to end on because it's true and it's profound and it's part of what the WTO has contributed to achieving. So with that, Doug, hold up the cover again, please. Hold up the cover of the hard copy. Trade and Stuff, nice cover. Thank you all for joining us today. Thanks to my colleagues, Doug Irwin and Annabelle Gonzalez, but thanks especially to Ralph Ossa, the Chief Economist of the WTO, and congratulations to him and his team. The World Trade Report 2023 is confronting some of the biggest issues head-on and will be a resource that we all should be citing and using as we continue these discussions ahead. Thanks very much.